For some crimes, there is no redemption. In April 2025, 4 men finally faced the punishment they had spent years trying to escape. Today, we take you through their final meals, their last words, and the horrific acts that led them to death row as we count down their final moments before execution. Case number 1, Michael Tanzi. We begin with a case of Michael Tanzi, a man whose final sunset came at 6:12 p.m. on April 8, 2025, nearly 25 years after he turned a Florida lunch break into a deadly nightmare. In April 2000, Tanzi was arrested for the murder of Janet Acosta, a production worker at the South Florida newspaper, the Miami Herald. Every afternoon during her lunch break, Janet would drive her Plymouth Voyager van a short distance from the Herald's former headquarters on MacArthur Causeway to enjoy a quiet read at the Japanese Rock Garden on Watson Island. On that fateful afternoon, 49-year-old Acosta was sitting in her van when 23-year-old Tanzi approached and asked for a cigarette. Instead, he reportedly punched her in the face, forced her into the van's back seat, and drove her to Homestead, south of Miami. There, he stopped at a gas station where he bound and gagged her before stealing $53 in cash. He then drove to Tavernier in the Florida Keys, where he forced her to help him withdraw money using her ATM card, threatening her with a box cutter. With a sizable amount of cash now on hand, Tanzi could have easily attempted an escape, but that wasn't on his mind. Instead, he chose to purchase a set of duct tape and razor blades at a hardware store. He then taped Acosta's eyes and mouth in an attempt to silence her. The pair's final stop was in an isolated area of Cudjoe Key, about 140 miles southwest of Miami, where Tanzi eventually and strangled Acosta. With his violent urges fulfilled, Tanzi dumped her lifeless body in the thick mangroves near a public boat ramp far from any passerby. When Acosta, a dedicated employee of 25 years, failed to return from her lunch break, her co-workers grew worried. She usually came back within an hour, but it was already evening. They decided to alert a supervisor. Her phone was unresponsive, so using company resources, her banking activity was tracked. The Miami police were notified. Officers quickly sprang into action and eventually found her van abandoned in Key West. Tanzi was later apprehended while trying to re-enter Acosta's vehicle. He confessed and led authorities to her body, located about 20 miles north of Cudjoe Key, where the van had been found. He was convicted of first-degree murder, carjacking, kidnapping, and armed robbery, with the jury unanimously recommending the death sentence in a 12-0 vote in 2003. Tanzi filed multiple appeals, citing morbid obesity and chronic back pain that affected his legs as reasons he should not face execution. The court rejected these claims, stating that his conditions had been known since 2009 and that the appeal was not timely. His defense attorneys also tried to save him from the death penalty, pointing to his mental health struggles and a troubled childhood, but the jury saw him for what he was, a cold, calculated killer beyond forgiveness. On the day of his execution, Tanzi received only one visit from a spiritual advisor. His final meal included a pork chop, bacon, a baked potato, corn, soda, ice cream, and a candy bar. In his final words, he apologized to the victim's family before softly reciting a Bible verse. He was then injected with a 3-drug cocktail. His chest heaved for about 3 minutes before he finally stopped breathing. Faced with certain death, Tanzi's sudden switch to becoming religious might not be so surprising, but the extent of this next inmate's crimes and his stubborn refusal to accept guilt will shock all your moral boundaries. Case number 2, Mikhail Dean Mahdi. In early July 2004, Mikhail Dean Motti, freshly released from a maximum security prison at just 21 years old, was suspected of a chilling crime. Greg Jones, a man known around the area, was found dead just 2 miles from Dean's home in Virginia. Allegedly, Dean had stabbed and killed him after a drug deal between them had gone wrong. Determined to keep his freedom, he decided to go on the run. On July 14th, Dean fled Virginia with a .380 caliber pistol, a set of license plates, and a station wagon stolen from his neighbor. His destination? North Carolina, where he hoped to find enough cover from the law that was hot on his heels. Little did he know, these were just the first steps toward getting drenched in a bloodbath. The next day, at an Exxon gas station near Winston-Salem, Dean stopped to buy a beer. The clerk, 29-year-old Christopher Jason Boggs, was shot point blank in the head when he tried to check Dean's ID. As Boggs' body hit the floor, Dean reached over the counter and shot him again before trying to open the store's cash register. When his efforts to pry it open failed, a frustrated Dean took off in the stolen wagon once more, this time headed for Columbia, South Carolina. On July 18th, around 3:30 a.m., Dean found himself at the intersection of Bull Street and Washington Street in Columbia, who had looked down to find a CD and looked up to see a gun pointed at his face. Now, behind the wheel of Pitt's red Ford Expedition, Dean swapped its license plates for the ones from the stolen station wagon and drove off, headed southeast. About 35 minutes later, he pulled into a Hess gas station at Calhoun County, where staff grew suspicious when the pump rejected Motti's credit cards. Someone dialed 911, and sensing his cover was blown, Dean ditched the stolen vehicle and fled on foot. He ran less than a mile before stumbling upon a shed, where he held up for the rest of the day, calmly watching television like he had all the time in the world. When boredom set in, he poked around the shed and found a stash of guns, completely unaware of who they belonged to. By evening, the owner of the shed, Captain James Myers, a 56-year-old off-duty officer, returned home. He had just come back from a party with his wife and kids, not knowing that the wonderful day he had just enjoyed was about to nosedive in the worst way possible. As soon as he stepped inside, Myers was ambushed by Dean, who shot him 9 times with his own shotgun. Older, slower, and caught off guard, Myers never stood a chance. 3 of the shots struck him in the head, and 1 tore through his heart. He died where he fell. Dean then doused Myers' body with diesel fuel, set it on fire, and took off in Myers' police truck. When Myers took too long to return, his wife, who was also a law enforcement officer, went looking for him in the shed. The sight that met her was something no one should ever have to face. Her husband's charred body lay crumpled on the floor. Police were quickly alerted, and a manhunt was launched. Dean managed to stay ahead of them for a while, but on July 21st, he was finally caught on the 5th floor of a condominium complex in Satellite Beach, Florida. In court, Dean received 2 death sentences, one in South Carolina in 2006 for the murder of Myers, and a second 5 years later in 2011 for the murder of Boggs. But even behind bars, Deans couldn't stay out of trouble. At just 23 when he got his first sentence, he was back at it 3 years later in 2009, alongside another inmate, condemned serial killer Quincy Allen. Dean attempted to murder a prison staff member named Nathan Sasser. They lured him out with a request to go to the basketball court, but once outside, the 2 pounced and stabbed him repeatedly in a violent attack. Somehow, Sasser survived, but his mind didn't. Crippled by panic attacks, he was eventually forced to quit his job as a prison guard. As for Dean, he lost every privilege he once had behind bars, though his death sentence stayed firmly in place. The only question left was, when would it be served? For over a decade, South Carolina couldn't get lethal injection drugs, bringing executions in the state to a standstill. Then, on September 20th, 2024, after a 13-year hiatus, the state rewrote its laws, bringing back the electric chair and adding a third option, the firing squad. On March 14th, 2025, Dean's death warrant was signed, giving him 2 weeks to choose his method of execution. In the end, he settled on the firing squad. Now, some 16 years later, justice was fully served. Dean's final meal consisted of a medium rare ribeye steak, mushroom risotto, broccoli, collard greens, cheesecake, and a sweet tea. Unlike many other prisoners on death row, Dean did not make a final statement, nor did he look at any of the witnesses. However, he suffered the same fate. On April 11th, he was put to death by firing squad at the Broad River Correctional Institution. 3 prison staff were instructed to fire simultaneously, with all of them aiming at a bullseye target on Dean's chest. The firing squad fired at 6:01 p.m. and Dean was dead less than 4 minutes after the shots were fired. His life came to a close at 42 years of age. And by that point, he had already spent around 68% of it in and out of juvenile and adult correctional centers. The firing squad was the best way for this monster to be executed. But this next inmate took covering up his tracks to a whole new level. Case number 3, Moises Mendoza. On March 18, 2004, a small Texas town was shattered by a brutal crime that would haunt its people for years to come. Rachel O'Neill Tolson, a 20-year-old single mother, vanished from her home in Farmsville without a trace. The search began immediately, and suspicion quickly fell on Moises Mendoza, a local man who'd been seen speaking with Rachel at a party just days before her disappearance. 5 days later, on March 23rd, the search ended in horror. A man scoring a Collin County creek bed for arrowheads stumbled upon Rachel's burned remains. The body was so badly charred that identification was only possible through dental records. The town's worst fears had come true. This was no accident, it was murder. The next day, Mendoza was arrested. His own guilt exposed him when he called a friend and confessed to the killing. That friend went straight to the police. During interrogation, investigators learned that Mendoza had forced Tolson into a secluded field near his home, where he her, strangled her, and then stabbed her in the throat. He left her body in the field for several days before returning to wrap it in a tarp and carry it to his cousin's land in Farmersville. There he burned the body and threw it into a creek bed located 3 miles east of town. In court, Mendoza's history of physical and sexual violence was presented to the jury. The defense tried to argue for a mitigated sentence by pointing to his teenage depression. In 2005, he was eventually sentenced to death. 20 years later, on April 23, 2025, 41-year-old Moises Mendoza was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit, making him the 3rd prisoner to be executed in Texas this year. His final words were an apology to Tolson's daughter, who was just 6 months old when he was arrested, and to her other relatives. He said he was sorry for taking away a mother and a loved one. He also spoke to his wife, sister, and 2 friends in Spanish, saying, "I love you. I am with you. I am well and at peace." 19 minutes after the drugs were administered, Mendoza drew his last breath. And with that, the chapter closed on a crime that had haunted Farmersville for 2 decades. While Mendoza had allowed a case of unrequited love to drive him to monstrous lengths, this next case shows what happens when a trusted family member lets a twisted fantasy turn him into the very devil himself. Case number 4. James Osgood. In 2010, 44-year-old Tracy Lynn Wildman was trying to get a fresh start at life. She'd just gotten a divorce and had moved across the country away from her daughter. Settling down in Chilton County, she'd gotten a job at a nursing home, a place of her own, and had saved enough for a car. Life was finally looking up for her until October 13th. Tracy was in her bedroom when she was attacked by James Osgood and his girlfriend, Tanya Van Dyke, Tracy's own cousin. The pair then Tracy at gunpoint and forced her to perform sex acts on them before Osgood slashed her throat repeatedly and finally stabbed her in the back. 10 days later, her employer found her lifeless body at home after she'd been absent from work. A report was filed and the pair was quickly arrested. Van Dyke was sentenced to life imprisonment, while Osgood was given a death sentence in a 40-minute unanimous jury decision in 2014. In his confession, Osgood said he remembered seeing fear in Tracy's eyes and that there was a lot of cutting. Surprisingly, according to him, the cutting wasn't done out of anger, but fear. He said it was nothing against her. She just needed to quit fighting and go. Then in 2016, an appeals court threw out his earlier 2014 death sentence, ruling that the judge had given out improper instructions to the jurors. Then at a sentencing in 2018, Osgood himself asked for the death penalty. He didn't want the families to endure another hearing, stating that he didn't want to go on wasting everyone's time and money. On the 23rd of April this year, he had 12 visitors and answered 7 phone calls. The next day, April 24, 2025, was the appointed day. That day, he received 11 visitors, including his sister, daughter, and friends, and also answered 1 call before his execution. Osgood had breakfast and snacks, but declined lunch, instead requesting pizza for his final meal. That evening, Osgood was executed by lethal injection at Alabama's William C. Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore. The execution was cleared to start around 6:12 p.m., and by 6:35 p.m., he was pronounced dead. And that's a wrap on all the executions that were carried out in April this year. Their deaths definitely provided closure for their victims' loved ones, but the conversation around capital punishment is still far from over. Anyway, what did you think? Which of those stories affected you the most? Let us know in the comments, and do well to subscribe too.